say before I get too started, I'm really thrilled to be here on behalf of the organization, and I'm really grateful to be able to participate in this project mission. All right. So the first and arguably most important stream of communication that you need to keep open is quite obviously teacher-student communication. And so there's a few things, and you can kind of just picture this as a checklist. That's certainly what I do. After you're done teaching, you just basically go through every single one of these every single week and make sure that for the next week, you're good on all of these things and that your students are good on all of these things. So here's a non-exhaustive list. Meeting times, of course, obviously meeting times might be recurring. If they are, you just need to make sure that it's going to happen every single week and that they know where to go and when to go there. But always make sure that your kids know when the content and the objective of the lesson is going to come up so they know what to expect. Also, tell them about the relative difficulty of the lesson. So if a lesson's coming up that's more difficult, then tell them about it so that they can prepare either by making sure that they're good on past material or that they can just maybe look at the slides in advance, depending on what your teaching style is. And then also, this is not really something that many people think about, but you need to keep a communication line open between you and each student about how they're doing. Because students implicitly rely on you for support and indicator clues on their performance in the class. And if you're just kind of busy presenting content as this inanimate object that just spits out material, then you're never going to really build a relationship with the student, and they're never going to be able to feel like they get that much out of the class. So an educational experience requires both people to really want to get to know the other person, and that definitely falls mostly on you to make sure that they know what they're doing well, they know what they're not doing well, they feel like you're paying attention to them, that you have an evaluation of them. Obviously, don't take this as an excuse to be the tyrant that makes the kids fear you, but take this as an opportunity to form healthy impressions between you and your students so that they feel attended to and listened to. And then obviously, probably the most important thing is that you are very clear on what the homework assignment is for the next week. So again, after you're done teaching, when you log off of Zoom, before you go about your day, just make sure that the homework resources are up somewhere wherever you've told them they're going to be uploaded, because it's very frustrating for a student to not know what they're doing or when it's due, and then have something get wrong or mess something up because of it. Along those same lines, you want to make sure that homework assignments are really specific. You're wanting to minimize the amount of time that students are just staring at a blank page or a blank Word document and not really knowing how to start. And it's a really weird transition going from being the student and being the teacher, because writing homework questions is not as easy as it seems. So one really helpful thing is to be as clear, basically as clear as possible, as specific as possible, so that the student never feels like they don't know where to begin on an assignment. So another important line of communication is between the teacher and the organization. So here are a few ideas on this slide. Most importantly, you need to communicate with Lex Youth head teachers and just other Lex Youth resources so that you can stay in touch with how you're doing, if there's any problems, or if you need extra resources. It's never good for the teacher to exist in a bubble within an organization, because if you do, then the students are going to start feeling like they don't have the full institutional support. And your students will be able to tell that you might be a little different from other classes, for instance, or that you are receiving the full support of the organization. So be in constant communication with the head teachers and with any other staff members from Lex Youth. Express your problems, express the things that are going correctly. This isn't just a form of accountability. This is a really helpful resource for you so that you feel like you can keep teaching at a stable level. I just skipped a slide by accident. There we go. All right. And then also just make sure you log your tutoring hours, as was already mentioned, and come to all the applicable meetings. I know it's really hard to plan those ahead, but just put them in your calendar. If you don't use calendars, then start using calendars, because they'll save your life, I promise. Okay. And then the final line of communication is between the teacher and the parent, obviously. It's just the nature of it that kids sometimes don't really pay attention when things are being told about what they should do and when they should do it. And that's why isn't responsible for keeping up with literally everything themselves. So the most important things to communicate with the parents are when the next meeting is, what they have to do for that next meeting, and if there's any specific problems that need to be dealt with before the next meeting. So if you have a kid that's being really disruptive in class, or if you have just a kid that's doing really well and you want them to feel rewarded for doing well, then that's a great opportunity to tell the parent to open a line of communication with either parent. Messaging systems widely vary, but you can use Gmail, WeChat, anything else that works for you. Okay, so just think about all those three things, teacher, parent, teacher organization, and teacher student as checklists that you have to do after every time you teach, and it's gonna make your job a lot easier. So now we really get into the meat and potatoes, which is how to take just mere content presentation and elevate it into an actually masterfully communicated presentation. So first, the goal of communication, it helps to orient it about what it is and what it is not. The goal of communication is not actually really just to inform, persuade, or request things. And that's what you'll often hear, but it's not true. The goal of communication on a very psychological level is to build a relationship with somebody. And if you use that relationship as a precursor through which you present that information, then I promise you your kid will get a lot more out of that inner experience. You probably also will get more out of teaching those kids if you focus on communication as a method of building relationships instead of just delivering content to people. So we accomplish building relationships through 4 different styles of communication. And only one of these styles are we really used to, using our words, but all 3 of these, including nonverbal and visual communication, are equally important in delivering content well and efficiently to your students every single week. So we're gonna look at each of these 4 styles. The first, and obviously the most obvious, is verbal communication, which uses spoken words. Verbal communication actually only accounts about 5 to 10% of our communication with other people as humans, and yet it's what we pay most conscious awareness to. So we're not really consciously processing body language or other forms of communication. We're trying really hard to attend to people when they're speaking. So here are some tips and tricks to help accomplish verbal communication. It's really difficult to just say communicate clearly or communicate fluently. And so at the end of the day, this is all going to be about practicing these things and even recording yourself in front of a camera, watching, knowing how you speak so that you can start implementing these things. It's really easy though to start using jargon or terms. Don't do it. Emphasize main ideas, keep it super clear, keep it super concise. The more jargon you use does not mean that you know more material, and it doesn't make you a better teacher, and it doesn't make you smarter. It makes you a worse teacher because you're now on a different playing field than your student. You want to be on the same playing field at all times. Think before you speak is obviously a cliche, but it really helps to take a pause in between sentences sometime and just make sure that the intent of the next sentence is clear and consistent with the outline and objective of the lesson that you're teaching. Otherwise, basically don't say it. And here is the number 1 trick I would give to accomplishing successful verbal communication, which is actually just to listen, which is the easy part. A lot of times when you're teaching, it's really easy to just, again, present the content off of the slide without really looking at your students' faces. So what you want to do is you want to get in and get exercises going with your kids that get them talking. Figure out how they sound when they normally talk, what kind of faces they make, what their expression and total impression are from week to week. And that'll help you establish a baseline off of which you can assess variance. Is this kid maybe extra stressed this week? Do they seem a little less focused this week? Because listening and knowing those things about your students in your classroom is going to help you adjust your verbal communication strategy in order to adapt to it and create a better educational experience for that particular week. So one example is sometimes when I'm teaching, I find that my class is participating a little extra than usual, and that's great. So I'll usually go for more of a question-based strategy. I'll ask lots of questions instead of just presenting the content because people are willing and able to answer those questions, and it keeps them more engaged. But times when they're not feeling as participatory, it's not really that productive to just wait 30 seconds while somebody raises their hand every single question you ask. And that's where listening gets involved with how we verbally communicate and what. And then obviously you want to adjust the tone, your confidence level, and your diction, so the words that you use for the particular audience that you're in. You also want to make sure, for instance, that you're like not using sarcasm when students, for instance, aren't very sarcastic. So in one of my classes, we play Kahoot quizzes every week to master debate concepts. And there's one kid, for instance, that always wins. You know, I can make fun of that kid for always winning, but only if they're okay with me using that level of sarcasm and they're willing to engage with it, be funny, right? They have that kind of sense of humor. You don't want to try those things without knowing that, because then that can actually feel alienating for a student. And so jokes are great. It's a great way to engage with your student. Comedy is great, but you never want to risk alienating a student or alienating a student's feelings. And that's one of the worst things you can do with verbal communication. So as I mentioned previously, nonverbal communication by modern scientific estimates actually accounts for 90 to 95% of our total communication, meaning that people either implicitly or explicitly are processing your nonverbal cues more than they're processing your verbal cues. And so nonverbal cues include things like facial expressions, posture, hand movements, eye contact, and touch. but the big ones here are facial expressions, eye contact, and hand movements. I guess you can kind of fit posture in with hand movements as well. So it's really about recording yourself, seeing yourself talk. I know it's really cringy, uncomfortable to maybe just give an impromptu speech, record yourself on your phone and then watch it back. It's really uncomfortable at times, but you can't make your nonverbal communication better if you're not aware of how you're currently communicating. And so you want to be aware as to whether your resting face is sad or happy, or when you're talking about something you're really passionate about, which I'm sure you all are really passionate about the things you're teaching. Do you get really angry when you're communicating those things that you're passionate about? Maybe not actually, but do you seem angry, right? You don't want to come across as that angry guy because that's no fun to be around in class, right? So be aware of how you're non-verbally presenting yourself so that you can change it. And you can change that over time. It is gradual, but it'll make the classroom environment way better. Also convey your message through deliberate actions. So there's a bunch of science about this. It's all pretty controversial, but for instance, at the end of the Obama administration, a big social science experiment was ran, and they found that Obama's head posture, which was always about 5 degrees to the right, was scientifically the most positive and optimistic head posture for somebody. Not 5 degrees to the left, but 5 degrees to the right, funny enough, right? And so you can do some research, what kind of gestures do you want to use? What helps you convey the message of your class? You can get really nitty-gritty if you want to. I'm not suggesting you hold your head 5 degrees to the right. That's just an example. But if you're in control of it, then you can deliberately change your actions to foster the class environment that you're trying to attain. Obviously, at all times, opt for signaling confidence, engagement, curiosity, and really you should try to be varying your gestures, your posture as much as possible. Being boring is the worst possible thing. And so if you're energetic, if there's times when you're acting a certain way, there's times you're acting a different way, it keeps students engaged. It all needs to be under the umbrella of confidence, engagement, and curiosity, but there's different ways that we can express ourselves under those overarching umbrellas. Written communication is probably the most important in terms of actual educational value. And here's what I mean by that. If you just verbally present something, the chances of a kid retaining that are actually pretty low. But if you verbally present something, pictorially present something, and present it in written words, that's 3 different modes of memory encoding, and cognitive psychology shows their retention is way higher. So written communication is want to have a successful learning environment. So these are just some examples: emails, social media, contracts, slideshows, etc. Anything that's in words. And so as the slide indicates, you can use formatting fonts and colors, even though you don't have as much control over written words as you do over spoken words, you can still use it to your advantage. And so on the right, there's 2 examples. On the top example, the when and where is bolded, and there's a convenient hyperlink as to how you can access the Zoom classroom. So it's lowering those barriers as much as possible and drawing the eye to the important information. And so, yeah, you want to be as simple as possible. You do not want to be verbose. You want to limit your homework assignments to like a paragraph if possible, so that they don't get bored reading the homework assignment. Because if they get bored reading the homework assignment, guess who's not doing the homework assignment, right? So keep your written communication very polished, and that'll help your entire class environment mesh better. Also, it's not a great look for teachers to have grammatical mistakes in their written communication. There's always forgiveness for things that we speak, but there's not usually forgiveness for things that we write. So just try to proofread everything. A few mistakes are okay, but if you do it consistently throughout the semester, your kids start wondering who's really the teacher and who's really the student, right? So you want to be polished at all times so that you kind of maintain that level of credibility that your kids and students are looking for. All right, and then finally we have visual communication, which is probably the most impactful and powerful, even though it's not the most pervasive in everyday speech, because we can communicate messages through images, which are really powerful in that they're attentive. So a lot of our world, especially reading, is just filled with black and white text. So when we see something with color, or even see something that isn't linguistically comprised, our attention literally psychologically snaps there. We're trained to just go to the novel stimulus, which in this case is the picture. So on a very deep psychological level, you should be using pictures, even if they're pictures that don't exactly add value to your presentation, they just complement your presentation. It's really good because then your kid will just be looking at the slide or will be looking at something that you want them to look at instead of just trying to passively listen. So here are some examples and some general tips and tricks. You want to avoid using cliches, but that being said, like the pictures on the right over here, if you pair them with content that it makes sense, then it works. If you always have a picture of a handshake when you're talking about compromising in debate, for instance, which is what I teach, then your kid will then begin to associate that picture with the content that you're teaching. You snap back to the picture and it serves as a retrieval mechanism. It'll help them, right? And so that's a really useful thing for PowerPoint presentations. And then also in general, usually avoid graphs and data. This is unless the graph and the data presents the information more simply than you can with words. You can present the information more simply with words, do it that way. But if a graph is more simple, then it's okay. You just don't want to add graphs because you don't want to add graphs flippantly because they can just be overcomplicated and it can actually be much simpler to just explain things normally. And then you want to use to engage your audience. So the golden rule is that if you're using PowerPoint slides, to use a picture at least every 3 slides, because by that point, your kids' attention will probably be a little bit diminished. Videos are super useful. If you can show them videos of people doing things, then it really snaps their attention super fast. And then they're engaged for like another 5 to 15 minutes, right? So you just kind of want to think about it in terms of attention span. Yes, it's their job to be attentive and be focused, but it's also your job to do everything possible to help them be attentive and focused. So that's a two-way relationship, and don't cheat yourself out of doing things that could actually be really productive for your classroom environment. And then lastly, I believe there's a bunch of resources that we've prepared to kind of give you as you're exploring how to communicate better and how to begin teaching. And so here's a bunch of articles about communication, types of communication, communication tips. At the end of the day, I would say this: you're never going to get better at communication just by reading these articles. You're only going to get better by reading these articles, learning about a concept, and then immediately going and trying it. So even if you don't record yourself, give yourself prompts to talk about. Practice teaching stuff. If you're a chess teacher, then practice talking about a chess scenario and talk about it until you're happy with how you sound when you're talking about it. And that practice is going to take you from knowing what you should do to actually doing what you should do. And that's how you achieve communication mastery and overall learning and educational effectiveness in the classroom. So that's all I have. Thanks so much for listening. And I believe we're going into breakout rooms now.
Yeah, so I'll be